What you're about to hear is a tale so horrifying, so steeped in maritime terror and supernatural vengeance, that it has haunted the docks and waterways of New Orleans for over a century. This is not merely another ghost story whispered in the taverns of the French Quarter. This is the documented account of 21 sailors who embarked on what they believed would be a routine voyage, only to find themselves passengers on a vessel that sailed not through earthly waters but through the cursed realm where the sins of the living are judged by the restless dead. This is the true story of the final voyage of the merchant vessel Evangeline, and the night when 21 souls discovered that some debts can only be paid in blood and terror. The year was 1903, and the port of New Orleans stood as one of the busiest maritime hubs in the Americas, its wharves lined with vessels from every corner of the globe carrying cargo that would fuel the growing industrial economy of the United States. The Mississippi River served as the great highway that connected the heartland of America to the markets of the world, and New Orleans was the gateway through which this commerce flowed in an endless stream of ships, barges, and steamboats that filled the air with the sounds of progress and prosperity. The French Quarter, with its narrow streets and ancient buildings, remained the cultural heart of the city, but the real economic power lay along the riverfront, where fortunes were made and lost with each tide. It was here that the merchant vessel Evangeline was moored on the evening of November 15, 1903, preparing for what should have been a routine cargo run to Havana, Cuba, carrying a mixed shipment of cotton, sugar, and manufactured goods that represented the diverse economic interests of Louisiana's recovering post-war economy. The Evangeline was a steam-powered cargo vessel of modest size, built in 1885 and owned by the Thibodeau Shipping Company, a family enterprise that had survived the devastation of the Civil War through careful political maneuvering and strategic alliances with both Confederate and Union interests. The ship had a reputation for reliability and efficiency, having completed hundreds of voyages throughout the Gulf of Mexico without serious incident, making it a preferred vessel for merchants who valued punctuality and safety over speed or luxury. Captain Armand Boudreau was a veteran mariner whose family had been involved in Louisiana shipping for 3 generations, inheriting not only his father's ship but also his knowledge of the treacherous waters and hidden dangers that characterized navigation in the Gulf Coast region. At 52 years of age, he was considered one of the most experienced captains operating out of New Orleans, with an intimate understanding of weather patterns, currents, and the supernatural folklore that sailors used to explain the unexplainable phenomena they encountered on the open water. However, what Captain Boudreau did not know was that his ship had been selected for a very different kind of voyage, one that would test not his navigational skills but his moral character and that of his crew. The cargo manifest that he had been given was accurate as far as it went, but it did not include the most significant item that would be loaded onto the Evangeline that night, the vengeful spirit of Marie-Josephine Boudreau, his own great-grandmother, who had been murdered by pirates in 1847 and whose restless soul had been waiting 56 years for the opportunity to claim justice against those who profited from the suffering of others. The crew of 20 men who had signed on for the Havana voyage represented the typical mix of nationalities and backgrounds that characterized maritime labor in the early 20th century. There were Irish immigrants seeking steady work in their new homeland, freed slaves and their descendants who had found employment on the docks and ships of New Orleans, French Creoles whose families had been involved in shipping for generations, and a handful of foreign sailors who had jumped ship from other vessels and were working their way back to their home ports. Among the crew members were several individuals whose presence on the Evangeline was not coincidental but had been arranged by supernatural forces that operated beyond the understanding of mortal men. First Mate Jacques Thibodeau was a direct descendant of the pirate captain who had murdered Marie-Josephine Boudreau, though he was unaware of this family connection and the debt of blood that had been accumulating interest for over half a century. The ship's cook, a massive man known only as Big Jim, carried the bloodline of another member of the pirate crew that had attacked Marie-Josephine's vessel, while the boatswain, Henri Dubois, was the great-grandson of the fence who had sold the stolen cargo from that long-ago raid. These men had been drawn to the Evangeline through a series of seemingly random circumstances that had actually been orchestrated by spiritual forces seeking to gather all the descendants of the original perpetrators in one place where justice could finally be administered. The loading of the Evangeline's cargo began at sunset on November 15, with stevedores working by the light of torches and gas lamps to transfer the various goods from the warehouse to the ship's hold. The work proceeded normally until the final item was brought aboard, a wooden chest that had been discovered in the basement of an old Creole mansion that was being demolished to make way for modern construction. The chest was said to contain family heirlooms and documents, but its true contents were far more significant than anyone realized. Inside the ornate wooden chest lay the personal effects of Marie-Josephine Boudreau, including her jewelry, letters, and most importantly, a small silver locket that contained a lock of her hair and a miniature portrait of her infant daughter. These items had been recovered from the pirate ship that had killed her, but they had never been returned to her family, instead being sold to collectors who had no understanding of their supernatural significance. The moment the chest was placed in the Evangeline's hold, the ship's atmosphere began to change in ways that were subtle at first but would become increasingly apparent as the voyage progressed. The temperature dropped noticeably despite the warm November evening, and several crew members reported hearing what sounded like a woman weeping somewhere deep within the ship's structure, though searches revealed no source for the mysterious sounds. Captain Boudreau initially dismissed these reports as the typical superstitions that plagued sailors, but his own family's connection to the supernatural traditions of Louisiana made him more sensitive to spiritual phenomena than he cared to admit. As the ship prepared to depart, he found himself experiencing a growing sense of unease that had no rational explanation, as if the Evangeline had somehow become a different vessel than the one he had commanded for the past 15 years. The departure from New Orleans proceeded according to schedule, with the Evangeline casting off her moorings at precisely 10 p.m. and beginning her journey down the Mississippi River toward the Gulf of Mexico. The night was clear and calm, with a full moon providing excellent visibility for navigation, yet several crew members reported seeing strange lights in the water that seemed to follow the ship as it made its way toward open water. The first supernatural manifestation occurred as the Evangeline passed through the mouth of the Mississippi and entered the Gulf of Mexico. The ship's compass began to spin wildly, pointing in directions that had no relationship to magnetic north, while the chronometer stopped working entirely, leaving the crew without reliable means of determining their position or the passage of time. These navigational failures should have been cause for immediate concern, but Captain Boudreau found himself strangely unconcerned, as if his judgment had been influenced by forces beyond his control. The second mate, a young Irishman named Patrick O'Malley, was the first to notice that the stars visible from the ship's deck did not match any constellation patterns he had learned during his years at sea. The sky above the Evangeline seemed to display celestial arrangements that belonged to no earthly geography, suggesting that the ship had somehow sailed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time into a realm where different physical laws applied. As the night progressed, the crew began to experience increasingly disturbing phenomena that challenged their understanding of reality and their own identities. Several men reported seeing their deceased relatives standing on the deck, while others claimed to hear voices speaking in languages they did not recognize but somehow understood. The ship itself seemed to be changing, with familiar passages leading to rooms that had not existed before and equipment that operated according to principles that defied conventional maritime engineering. The galley, where Big Jim prepared meals for the crew, became a focal point for supernatural activity as the cook found himself compelled to prepare dishes that he had never learned to make, using ingredients that had not been loaded onto the ship but appeared in his pantry as if placed there by invisible hands. The meals he served were unlike anything the crew had ever tasted, carrying flavors that seemed to evoke memories of places they had never been and experiences they had never had. First Mate Thibodeau began to experience vivid dreams that revealed details about his family's history that had been hidden from him throughout his life. In these supernatural visions, he witnessed his ancestors' participation in the pirate raid that had claimed Marie-Josephine's life, seeing through the eyes of the murderer as he struck down an innocent woman who had been traveling with her infant daughter to reunite with her husband in Cuba. The boatswain Henri Dubois found himself compelled to perform tasks that had no apparent purpose, rigging sails that did not exist and maintaining equipment that served no function on a steam-powered vessel. His actions seemed to be controlled by an external intelligence that was using his body to recreate the conditions that had existed on sailing ships from an earlier era, as if the Evangeline was being transformed into a vessel from the past. The most disturbing manifestation occurred in the ship's hold, where the wooden chest containing Marie-Josephine's belongings had begun to emit a soft, pulsing light that grew brighter as the night progressed. Crew members who ventured into the hold reported hearing the sound of a woman singing lullabies in French, while others claimed to see the ghostly figure of a young mother cradling an infant who seemed to glow with the same ethereal light that emanated from the chest. As dawn approached, the supernatural phenomena intensified rather than diminished, suggesting that the Evangeline had sailed so far from normal reality that the usual rules governing the relationship between day and night no longer Applied. The sun that rose over the ship was not the familiar yellow orb that illuminated earthly waters but rather a pale, cold light that cast no shadows and provided no warmth, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that filled the crew with existential dread. Captain Boudreaux's attempts to regain control of his vessel proved futile, as the ship's engines responded to commands that he had not given while the steering mechanism operated according to a course that had been set by an invisible navigator. His growing realization that the Evangeline was no longer under his command was accompanied by the emergence of memories that seemed to belong to someone else, visions of his great-grandmother's final moments that filled him with shame and horror. The crew's attempts to understand their situation were complicated by the discovery that their personal histories had somehow become intertwined with events from the past, as if the supernatural voyage was forcing them to confront the sins of their ancestors and take responsibility for crimes they had not personally committed. This collective experience of inherited guilt created a psychological pressure that pushed several men to the brink of madness. The ship's log, which Captain Boudreaux attempted to maintain despite the extraordinary circumstances, began to write itself, with entries appearing in handwriting that belonged to none of the crew members. These supernatural additions to the log described events from the 1847 pirate attack in vivid detail, providing a first-person account of Marie-Josephine's murder and the subsequent disposal of her body that had never been recorded in any historical document. The appearance of Marie-Josephine's spirit marked the climax of the supernatural voyage, as the ghostly figure materialized on the ship's deck carrying her infant daughter and demanding justice for the crimes that had been committed against them. Her presence transformed the Evangeline into a supernatural courtroom where the descendants of her murderers would be forced to stand trial for the sins of their ancestors. The trial that followed was unlike any legal proceeding that had ever been conducted on Earth, as Marie-Josephine served simultaneously as prosecutor, judge, and jury in a system of justice that operated according to cosmic rather than human law. The evidence presented included not only the historical facts of her murder but also the ongoing consequences of that crime for her family and the broader community that had been affected by the pirates' depredations. Each crew member was forced to confront the specific ways in which they had benefited from the wealth and opportunities that their ancestors had gained through violence and theft. The supernatural trial revealed how the profits from piracy had been invested in legitimate businesses that had provided subsequent generations with advantages that had been built upon a foundation of blood and suffering. First Mate Thibodeau was shown how his family's shipping business had been established using capital that had been stolen from Marie-Josephine and other victims of piracy, while Big Jim learned that his ancestors' participation in the raid had provided the resources that had allowed his family to purchase their freedom from slavery. The boatswain Henri Dubois discovered that his family's prosperity had been built upon the sale of goods stolen from murdered travelers, creating a legacy of wealth that had been passed down through generations who had remained ignorant of its criminal origins. The supernatural justice administered by Marie-Josephine was both terrible and merciful, as she offered each man the opportunity to make restitution for their ancestors' crimes through acts of sacrifice and service that would balance the cosmic scales that had been disturbed by the original murders. Those who accepted responsibility for their inherited guilt and committed themselves to making amends would be allowed to return to the world of the living, while those who refused to acknowledge their moral obligations would remain trapped aboard the phantom vessel forever. The choices made by the 21 crew members during this supernatural trial revealed the true nature of their characters and their willingness to accept responsibility for injustices that they had not personally committed but from which they had nonetheless benefited. Some men embraced the opportunity for redemption, while others rejected the very concept of inherited moral obligation, creating a division that would determine their ultimate fates. Captain Boudreaux was among those who accepted full responsibility for his ancestors' crimes, pledging to dedicate the remainder of his life to helping the families of piracy victims and working to eliminate the maritime violence that continued to plague the Gulf Coast region. His acceptance of moral responsibility earned him Marie-Josephine's forgiveness and the right to return to New Orleans, though he would carry the burden of his supernatural experience for the rest of his days. However, 7 members of the crew, including First Mate Thibodeau, refused to accept responsibility for crimes they had not committed, arguing that they could not be held accountable for the actions of ancestors they had never known. Their rejection of inherited moral obligation condemned them to remain aboard the Phantom Evangeline, where they would serve as eternal reminders of the consequences of refusing to acknowledge the ongoing impact of historical injustices. The 14 crew members who accepted Marie-Josephine's offer of redemption found themselves back in New Orleans harbor on the morning of November 17, with no memory of how they had returned but carrying the clear understanding that their lives had been permanently changed by their supernatural experience. The Evangeline itself was discovered floating empty near the mouth of the Mississippi, with no trace of the 7 men who had chosen to remain aboard the phantom vessel. The official investigation into the disappearance of the 7 crew members concluded that they had been lost overboard during a storm that had not been reported by any other vessels in the area, but the survivors knew the true explanation for their shipmates' fate. The supernatural trial had divided the crew between those who were willing to accept moral responsibility for inherited injustices and those who refused to acknowledge any obligation to address the crimes of the past. Captain Boudreau's subsequent career was marked by his dedication to maritime safety and his efforts to eliminate the piracy and violence that continued to threaten shipping in the Gulf of Mexico. He used his family's resources to establish a fund for the families of sailors who had been killed or injured by pirates, while also working with law enforcement agencies to track down and prosecute maritime criminals. The other survivors of the supernatural voyage found their lives similarly transformed by their experience aboard the Phantom Evangeline, as each man dedicated himself to making amends for his ancestors' crimes through acts of service and charity that addressed the ongoing consequences of historical injustices. Their collective efforts created a network of social reform that had a lasting impact on the maritime community of New Orleans. The wooden chest that had triggered the supernatural voyage was eventually returned to the descendants of Marie-Josephine Boudreau, who had been located through genealogical research funded by Captain Boudreau's guilt-driven investigation into his family's history. The return of these personal effects allowed Marie-Josephine's spirit to find the peace that had been denied to her for over half a century, finally laying to rest the supernatural forces that had orchestrated the Phantom voyage. However, the Phantom Evangeline itself was reported to continue sailing the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, carrying its crew of 7 condemned souls who had refused to accept responsibility for their inherited guilt. These sightings became part of maritime folklore, serving as a warning to sailors about the importance of acknowledging and addressing the moral debts that could be passed down through generations. The story of the Evangeline's final voyage became a touchstone for discussions about inherited moral responsibility and the ongoing impact of historical injustices on contemporary society. The supernatural trial that had taken place aboard the Phantom vessel provided a framework for understanding how the crimes of the past continue to influence the present and how individuals could be held accountable for benefits they had received from ancestral wrongdoing. The theological implications of the case were debated by religious scholars who struggled to reconcile the concept of inherited guilt with traditional Christian doctrines about individual moral responsibility. Some argued that the supernatural trial represented a form of divine justice that operated beyond human understanding, while others maintained that the entire incident was a manifestation of collective psychological trauma rather than genuine supernatural intervention. The legal community was similarly divided about the implications of the case for contemporary discussions about reparations and historical justice. Some legal scholars argued that the supernatural trial provided a model for addressing inherited injustices through voluntary acknowledgement and restitution, while others maintained that legal systems could not be based on supernatural revelations or inherited moral obligations. The psychological impact of the supernatural voyage on the survivors was studied by early practitioners of psychiatry who were interested in the relationship between guilt, trauma, and spiritual experience. The case provided insights into how individuals could be psychologically affected by learning about their ancestors' crimes and how the acceptance or rejection of inherited moral responsibility could influence mental health and personal development. Modern researchers studying the Evangeline case have noted its relevance to contemporary discussions about historical trauma and the intergenerational transmission of both guilt and healing. The story provides a framework for understanding how past injustices continue to influence present relationships and how communities can work together to address the ongoing consequences of historical crimes. The maritime industry's response to the Evangeline incident included increased attention to the historical context of shipping and trade, with some companies conducting research into their own corporate histories to identify and address any connections to historical injustices such as piracy, slavery, or exploitation of indigenous peoples. These efforts represented a form of corporate social responsibility that acknowledged the ongoing impact of past business practices. Contemporary discussions of the Evangeline case often focus on its relevance to ongoing debates about reparations for slavery, genocide, and other historical injustices. The supernatural trial that took place aboard the Phantom vessel serves as a metaphor for the kind of moral reckoning that many argue is necessary to address the continuing effects of past crimes on present communities. The environmental implications of the case have also attracted attention from researchers studying the relationship between historical trauma and the natural world. Some scholars argue that the supernatural phenomena associated with the Evangeline reflected the Earth's own response to the violence and exploitation that had characterized human interaction with maritime environments. The artistic legacy of the Evangeline incident has influenced Louisiana's cultural community, inspiring works of literature, music, and visual art that explore themes of inherited guilt, supernatural justice, and the ongoing impact of historical trauma on contemporary society. These artistic interpretations help to keep the story alive while also providing new perspectives on its meaning and relevance. As we approach the 121st anniversary of the Evangeline's final voyage, the story continues to resonate with those who recognize the ongoing relevance of questions about inherited moral responsibility and the importance of addressing historical injustices. The Phantom vessel serves as a reminder that some debts transcend individual lifetimes and that the pursuit of justice may require acknowledgement of wrongs that were committed by previous generations. The 7 souls who remain trapped aboard the Phantom Evangeline serve as eternal warnings about the consequences of refusing to accept responsibility for inherited benefits that were gained through violence and exploitation. Their continued voyage through supernatural waters reminds us that some moral debts cannot be escaped through denial or willful ignorance. If this haunting tale of supernatural justice and inherited moral responsibility has left you questioning the true nature of accountability and the ways in which the sins of the past continue to influence the present, please show your support by hitting that like button. Your engagement helps us continue to explore these profound mysteries where individual choices echo across generations and where the pursuit of justice transcends the boundaries of life and death. And if you haven't already joined our community of moral navigators here at Bayou Nightmares, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We delve deep into the supernatural consequences of historical injustices every week, bringing you stories of phantom vessels, inherited guilt, and the eternal struggle between those who accept responsibility for the past and those who refuse to acknowledge their moral obligations. From the haunted waters of the Gulf Coast to the hidden dimensions where justice sails eternal, we explore the mysteries that remind us that some voyages never truly end. It's important to remember that while the stories we share on Bayou Nightmares are carefully researched and often based on historical accounts, they are presented as entertainment and educational content. Some elements may be dramatized or interpreted through the lens of folklore and legend, though they are frequently inspired by real experiences of inherited trauma and the ongoing human struggle to address the moral debts of the past. Until we meet again in the realm where past and present converge on the eternal sea, keep navigating by the moral compass that guides us toward justice, keep acknowledging the debts we inherit from those who came before us, and remember that some voyages require us to chart courses through waters that exist beyond the boundaries of ordinary time and space. This has been Bayou Nightmares, where the dead demand justice, the guilty cannot hide forever, and every voyage carries the potential for both damnation and redemption on the endless sea of moral consequence.